Thanks for coming to my presentation. So the title is Pushing Team Creativity Through Technical Art, which is kind of vague. My working title was 40 minutes of me talking about shit I think is cool / interesting / important. So, brief introduction about myself. I've been working in the industry for a bit more than 12 years. I've been lucky to work on a bunch of cool franchises that I've been able to touch here and there. And most recently, I was the art director on the last 3 Wolfenstein games. The last game I shipped was Rage 2, which had some stuff in it, which looks really fucking awesome. And I used to call myself a 3D artist way back when I was pretty much only doing modeling and texturing. That was my sole focus. And then I moved on to doing a little bit of everything: environment art, technical art, art direction, concept art. And nowadays, I don't think even that's like a good description, because I do a little bit of everything, and I'm just a game developer. I always wanted to, like when I was a kid and I imagined worlds and stuff, I wanted to realize them. It wasn't, like sub-D modeling and UV mapping that was, what I was dreaming about. It was just realizing all these, cool ideas that you had. And these days with modern technology, there's just like, you can get so much closer to that goal that you had when I was a kid, and I just wanted to build these, worlds that I had in my head. And so you might ask yourself, what is this talk about again? It's a very good question, and it's a talk about the kind of unholy marriage that you have between art and technical art in the games industry. Because in the games industry today, like, a team can be anything from a single person to thousands of people spread across the world, and those teams, face very, very different challenges, both creatively, on how they, get to express their creativity and how creative they can be at work, and also, from a production standpoint and like the team perspective, how do you keep people motivated? How do you get the most out of your team? And also from a personal perspective, how do you make those people happy and grow as artists and grow as developers? And also from a production perspective, like how do you make sure you actually build a game and you just don't just waste your time doing stuff that in the end don't matter. And this talk focuses a bit on the different problems in team dynamics, motivation and ownership in the team, and how art teams can leverage modern technology and workflows to be more efficient, and in that way keep more of the creativity and ownership, with the artist, with the team. And how tech art saves the day, because that's basically it. So right now I am working at Neon Giant, which is a studio I co-founded with some other experienced developers from the AAA industry. We're a small team. We're about 11 people, so very small, but pretty high ambitions. We're working on our first game, which is a cyberpunk / sci-fi game, which features a lot of action. And that's pretty much all I can say about that at this point, unfortunately. It's marginally less ambitious than some Polish cyberpunk game you might have heard of. And part of the reason why we started Neon Giant is because we spent so much time in AAA, and we worked in different studios, teams, franchises, engines. We thought that there was a different way to build games than what we had experienced ourselves. And we felt that the time was right to see if we are right about that and we know what we're talking about, or if we're horribly wrong, everything's going to crash and burn. And we don't have an answer to that yet, but if you come back in a couple of years, maybe I have an answer for that. And we didn't really see so many opportunities to do what we wanted to do with Neon Giant, which is like a small, experienced team, like with very high ambitions, that really embrace and leverage like all the modern technology and workflow we can, in order to keep the team size down and make sure that the artists, or the game developers in general, have high amount of ownership, high creativity, and just have more fun, essentially. And video games are very interesting because it's a very creative and technical industry, but it's also very, very competitive. Everyone is just trying to outdo each other, outdo their previous efforts. And since we're so dependent on technology, it's a huge factor in how that works. And you can basically ruin a team or save a team or someone's passion just because of the tech involved. So it's not to be underestimated. It's pretty much the backbone of everything we do, right? And a lot of teams, problems like personal problems, like team, growing pains, etc., are caused by technology because you grow the team because you need to produce more stuff. And how do you produce stuff? You produce stuff with the tech, right? So it's pretty much the foundation of everything. And there are people that do this stuff for a living, like psychologists and managers, etc., and they probably have fancy terms and things for all these things. I don't. But these are some of the things that I've noticed through the years that happens in teams as they grow. And one of the big differences, between large teams and small teams, obviously in large teams you have a lot of people, so you have manpower to do basically anything. You can do, if you want to create custom technology, custom tools, you can just do that because you have people and you just put people on it and it's going to work itself out. And, problem is the more people you have, the harder it is to use those tools because you have way more people that you have to teach about those tools and if something breaks, etc. So it's just much, you can build the tools, but it's much harder to use them. So instead you have to foolproof those tools way more because you have to make sure that they work no matter if a guy who's like maybe in a different country uses them wrong and everything doesn't just blow up. And that's one of the problems and one of the reasons why it's so easy to just throw more people at it, right? You're like, okay, we have 100 people, let's just add 30 more. We don't have to think, like as long as you have the money, you can kind of just do that. You just put some more people on it, it's going to work itself out. And this always leads to growing pains and, team sizes keep inflating. Small teams, on the other hand, you don't really have a capability to create tools because you're just a bunch of people. You can't just go like, oh yeah, it's going to spend a month creating some tools because, you have a game to build and that's not going to happen by itself. And on the other hand, it's much, much faster to share knowledge because, if you have something new you're going to show someone, you can just literally turn around and go like, hey, look at this stuff, I just did this stuff. And they're like, okay, cool. And then you've informed everyone about this. In case of like a large AAA studio where you're like, we're going to book a meeting, we're going to write documentation, we're going to go through all this, then we're going to do a follow-up meeting and reviews to make sure that people are actually using the things we said in the meeting. And in a small studio, you can just turn around and just point at your screen and go, look at this cool shit I did. And same thing with new tools. If there's like a new experimental VR 3D program, you just like, I'm just going to try it out, and like 2 hours later, bam, it's part of our pipeline because it's me, I'm the pipeline. Same thing with textures. You want to change how the entire company makes their textures. There you go. It was just you anyway. So you can really jump on any new tools, any new experimental technology, just like that. Problem is that you have to rely on someone else to make that technology. But thankfully, we're at a point where there's quite a lot of tools being developed for games. So on the other hand, when you have this arms race that we have, and it's like this arms race, and it's very technical, and teams tend to grow over time. Like they're way, way bigger today than they were like 15 years ago, right? And in my experience, there are a few things that tend to pop up in teams that when they are growing. And in larger teams, people obviously have less direct ownership because there's more people in the team. Not everyone can have the same amount of ownership, right? So that's natural. And there's some factors that increase the likelihood of this happening, and I don't have a solution, but maybe talking about it might help. Not sure. So the problem is that if you grow as an artist and as a developer, and you're super ambitious, and you keep learning new things, and you try to make your part the best you can, you're like, you're focused, and the problem that can happen is sometimes the rest of your team, like your teammates, can actually become like an obstacle, and they become basically your opponent. Right, say that you're building weapons for a game, it's an FPS, and you spend a lot of time perfecting it, and you're super ambitious. It's the one part of the game where you're like, this is the part where I can actually influence everything, right? And you're working on these guns, and you're really proud of the result. It's like, there's some really sexy guns, they're amazing. And then comes some game designers like, hey, we're going to change how all the guns work now. So you have to redo all of them, and you don't have enough time to make them in a high quality again. And it's probably the best for the game, but it still sucks. Like, it's not fun when this happens. And the game's going to be a lot better for it, but it's screwing over your hard work, right? it's like you're an environment artist, and you made like, oh, I placed all these plants. It's like amazing composition. It's like, it's perfect. It's the best work I've done. And then some coder comes and say like, hey, you have to remove like 50% of your plants. And it's like, it sucks, but the game has to run, right? And that's one of those problems. It's like, because you take your, you actually take your mind off what you're doing because you're building a game, right? You have to keep your eye on the ball, as they say in sports ball. And the further away you are from the creative process, the more likely you are to, not care about, like, I don't care if the games are slightly more, or like the guns are slightly more fun, because now my guns look like shit, and I spent like 5 years on these. And that's another problem that I see, is that people are falling in love with the process of their work. So they are, if, for example, say that I've been doing textures in Photoshop for 15 years, and I'm amazing at making Photoshop textures. I have all the tricks, and I have all my little scripts, and it's like super fast, and all these little hacks. And then someone comes and like, hey, we're gonna do PBR now. We're gonna do substance painters, the new cool shit. And basically all those little tricks and little things you spent like 15 years perfecting are now kind of wasted. Because you're basically identifying yourself with your tools. You're not a game creator, you're a Photoshop texture artist. And this is also something that I've seen happen time and time again. And say that you don't do these things, and you're super communicative, you're always pushing forward, and you're like super appreciated, and you get promoted upwards, and you end up here instead. Where you're in a meeting room and you don't get to do any art anymore because you're so good at communicating that you get to do that instead. Which, may or may not have happened. So that's a problem, right? And in the flip side, like in smaller teams, you don't really have had like the opportunity to do the kind of high quality specialist stuff that you do in a AAA team. You can't be in a small indie team and go like, I'm going to spend 3 months per gun. It's going to be the best guns. Literally, our game is only going to have 3 guns, and that's it. There's nothing else in the game. Like, you can't do that in a small indie team, right? So it's very hard to find the balance there, right? You have to be invested in the game you're making if you're making a small indie game, because you don't have the luxury of making things that are high production quality, where you can say like, we make the best characters in the world. Because if you're a small indie game, the odds are that some 1,200 people team are going to make slightly more advanced stuff than you. And at the same time, there's like way more possibilities for artists today, like to have a career. It used to be only like, if you want to do games, you do games, and that's the only thing that will ever pay your bills, right? And now you have social media, you have Instagram, you have ArtStation, and you can do freelancing, you can do tutorials, you can sell products, you can do mentoring. There's like so many different things you can do as an artist today. And also the side thing to that is that there are rockstar artists today, people know who these artists are, they're amazing. And 15 years ago, you didn't really have rockstar artists that everyone knew because they followed them on social media, because we didn't have social media. And this means that it's harder than ever to keep, experienced artists, happy, and to keep them, in one place, because there's just so many options nowadays, which is awesome for artists, but it sucks for people who are, trying to build a team and keep them there. So, thankfully, something has shifted, and we're in the glorious future. And smaller teams can now kind of give you the same, production satisfaction like AAA productions have. So, and you don't have to be a AAA artist to make cutting-edge art anymore. And it's not so weird either, because 15, 20 years ago, it was pretty normal. You had smaller teams that were making really cutting-edge both tech and art, even though they were so small. For example, you have games like Doom 3, for example, when it came out, and it was cutting edge with technology, modeling, everything, and they were 25 people or something. So it's only the past generation of PlayStation 3, 360, when suddenly everything needed a high poly, everything we hand painted all these 1K, 2K textures in Photoshop, and then they looked like shit because we just compressed them to hell anyway. And there's no modern workflows. You just brute forced everything, and the teams just grew like crazy, right? So, the tools were not ready for this generational leap, right? So, there we go. So, how do we keep people motivated, and how do we keep fight to keep teams small and agile with as much ownership as possible. And how do we bridge the gap between these two extremes, so like tiny indie studios and giant AAA studios? As always, tech art is the answer. And I've always had the long-term goal of building worlds on my own. And when I started out, I was just trying to get as fast as possible at modeling and texturing. But then you kind of realize that that's not really the point, right? Because if you make the best models in the world and you're super fast, your game's not going to look good because of that, right? Because there's so many factors involved. Because you have the lighting, the texturing, the tech, the art direction, post-processing. It's a whole list of stuff, right? So once I got past that mental hurdle and thinking of my models as it's important that these models are the best looking ever, I started thinking about it in a completely different way, just trying to approach it from a completely different method, where I was just trying to get to a point where you can evaluate what is actually important as soon as possible. So, for example, here you have a robot from Wolfenstein 2, which has tons of details on it. It's got all these little parts, and it's high poly, and it's got springs and hydraulics and shit. And here's his butt and his legs, and it's got all these pieces, and they're rigged. And I was pretty proud of this model when I built it. And it has destruction. You can shoot off all the parts and so on. And here it is in the game, and it's maybe it's not the most important thing, right? It's like looking at a Rembrandt, and no one is going to come here and tell me that this is not a good painting, right? Because shame on you if you do. But if you zoom in, there you go. That's like my art right there. And you could remove this from the painting, and you can zoom in on all kinds of stuff, and it doesn't really look good when you zoom in, but the painting looks good, the big picture stuff is great. And that is pretty much how you need to approach making games look better, right? Because it's not well, from this game to the sequel, we just made the models look nicer, and now it just looks good. No, there's all kinds of stuff. You just have to raise the bar gradually. You need better lighting, you need better tech, better shaders, better textures, better models, better everything. And some of the best looking games out there have some really shit assets in them. And no one wants to make those assets. No one wants to be yeah, I worked on this amazing game. I made all these ugly assets, you see, that no one really focuses on. But you also kind of have to do that, because you have to make a game, right? So is it about the quality of the assets or the amount of the assets? Because you need all the assets, right? And it's a bit of both, because you can't just make everything look like shit, because then it's going to look like shit, right? But you need to focus the effort where it's actually important. You're making an FPS, obviously the guns are pretty important because they're in your face all the time. But maybe stuff in the background isn't so important all the time. And the problem is no one wants to be the guy who makes the stuff in the background that no one cares about. Unless you just care about making a game and you don't care about posting on ArtStation. So, knowing your tech, this sounds like a no-brainer, but it's surprisingly not. And it's about, not artists knowing how to make a low poly or making textures, etc. It's about having at the highest level, the creative direction, the art direction, that they're aware of what you can actually do with your technology. I mean, because normally everything comes from the top. The creative direction dictates we're gonna do this thing, and you're that's a horrible idea, but I guess we're doing that. And it might be super painful. It might turn out awesome. But if you're working against your tech, it's always going to be a pain in the ass. And also, unless you have unlimited time and budget, it's going to waste a lot of time trying to do stuff you really can't. So, for example, if your engine has amazing dynamic lighting, you should probably let people at the top know and make sure they're very aware of that, so that can be factored in the very beginning when you're creating the design for the game, right? In the same way, if you make, our game is going to be all about dynamic lighting, and you don't have any dynamic lighting, it might be, sad. And I've seen that exact thing happen. It's not pretty, and it's kind of painful, because it doesn't matter how good your art is if, you're fighting against the tech the entire time, right? So, For example, in Wolfenstein, in id Tech 5, you had the mega textures, and you can make everything unique. And if you look, but there was a fixed resolution, right? So if you walked up to the wall, it would be pretty low res. And at the same time, it wasn't really good at doing things like vistas either, because that just didn't work with how the mega textures worked. So the best case was doing something where it was kind of far away, but not really far away. And that's why we deliberately design things like you have very high ceilings, because you can't get close to them if they're high up. And you have like a gap in the middle there, so you have like the pillars, and you're like, oh nice, it's like textures and stuff, but you can't put your face into it and see like that it's actually pretty low res. So we deliberately designed around like, oh, this is the stuff we can do with the engine. Let's just do that the whole time. Because that's going to make the art look the best, and it's going to be the minimum amount of work. So this is I think it's a fantastic example, Vanishing of Ethan Carter by the Astronauts, which is brilliant use of technology in my mind. Using original, at least, Unreal 3. And Unreal 3 has very limited shading and reflection and so on. It's like an old engine, but it's very, very good at pushing out tons and tons of polygons and high quality, diffuse textures. So they went all in on that with the scans and the very nice baked ambient light. If you would try to do this today, even with an engine that doesn't have a very, very, very good dynamic light solution, it would look worse, right? So I mean, small indie team managed to basically make a game that looks better than most AAA titles at the time by embracing, the technology. So, and that leads me to setting limitations. For example, setting limitations for me is one of the most important creative drivers you can do, right? You have so many options. So if you don't decide what you're going to do, you basically have an endless amount of possibilities, which sounds awesome, but it isn't. Because so much of the workflow at any point can be decided by the artist. So are you going to do line art in Photoshop? Are you going to photo bash? Are you going to do VR sculpting with kit bash pieces? Or if you do modeling, are you going to do high poly models? Are you going to kit bash them? Or are you not? Are you not even going to do any high poly models? Are you going to use unique textures, trim textures, shaders, blah 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 blah? There's so many choices at the end, every turn for an artist, right? And limitations doesn't sound very sexy, but speed is. And it's very common, when you look at creatives in film, etc., that when people are making their first movie and it's a smash hit, and they did it with $5,000 in a camcorder, and people are like, this director is amazing, we give him $100 million, and then blah, because they are not really the limitations are good for creativity. But we can basically do anything right now in terms of workflows, etc. So we have to basically manufacture those limitations on our own. So the first limitation always comes from if you know your tech, there's your first set of limitations. Let's do the things that the tech can actually do. But then the second limitation is the workflow. And if you come up with a workflow and you basically set rules in place, and that will remove any question marks on how to build things. If there's only one way to build things, people are just going to focus on doing that thing as fast as possible and try to use it as much as possible. Bend the rules maybe, but still try to create things faster. It's basically just creating a high-speed lane for the artist, with no question marks. This is what you're going to do. And you don't need to figure out how to build things because you already know. And then also, how much time do you have? How much art do you have to create? How many artists do you have? Because it's better to set the realistic expectations and then work backwards from that, instead of trying we're just going to do it the good old-fashioned way and then hope that magically we just do all the things and we don't end up with half a game in the end. So it's better to just look at okay, we're going to do this enormous game. Maybe we don't have time to handcraft every single thing, unless you have unlimited budget and time. So this is an ancient demo thing that I did, where I was I'm going to use one texture for the entire scene because reasons. I wanted to try that, right? And it was fun. It allowed me to squeeze out things wherever I could, forcing myself to work with those limitations. And it's not really a good workflow for a game, right? It's time-consuming and it's kind of stupid. And why would you only have one texture? But it did teach me a lot of lessons, how to structure my shaders. That's the texture for the entire scene. But it did teach me a lot of things. And that experiment led to another, where I took it and made it a much larger scene, like dirtier environment, like can I build an entire city with this? And then, I just kept on working on these workflows, and the end result is what we're using at Neon Giant today, which I will get to in a bit. So, when you adapt the workflow to what you're doing, like how many of these things are you making? Like, does it actually matter? Does it actually matter if you optimize them? Because if you're only making one thing, you don't even really have to optimize it because it's not going to have any impact, right? Sometimes, like you can completely, like if you have a well-optimized game and you're like, you can basically just throw the high poly in there and no one would ever notice because it's such a small thing, right? It really depends on how many you're making, if it's worth it. So, for example, if you're making like an FPS weapon, here's like from Wolfenstein 2, it's a Diesel Kraftwerk, and it has procedural shaders on it and stuff in Modo, and it's like, I could bake those down and be like, okay, now we have a kind of textured gun, and like for free, it's super, like took no time to make. But is it worth it? Yeah, maybe if you do like 5 of them and you don't change anything, because otherwise it's just basically doing tech for tech reasons unless you actually force yourself to use it. So you need to actually commit to using it. People love to create really smart workflow tech things and then not reusing them. Because you're like, I made this generator thing, it can generate like bushes. And then you're like, I'm going to generate another bush. And you're like, nah, it can't generate tall bushes. I'm going to redo it so it also generates tall bushes. And I'm like, but now you just redid it. So people love doing that, but they hate, actually setting limitations. Because it's fun to feel smart because you created a thing, but it's not fun to have limitations. But you need to actually commit to doing that. If you're going to get like the time back from actually creating some smart system, you need to actually commit to using it. So you need to work smart, but you shouldn't work too smart. Because a lot of the problems is that people are overcomplicating things, and this completely goes back to what I was saying before, that people are, they're trying to do their thing the best they can, and that includes tech artists. They're like, I'm going to tech art the shit out of this thing, and it's become super complicated. And it's like, well, for example, in Bulletstorm we had like these birds that were flying away. It was just a particle effect with birds. Now, you could just go like, I'm just going to create a system that spawns birds randomly, and they have like, they're driven by vector fields, and it's amazing. And then you just use it like once. So like that would just be a waste of time. But that person would be like, I made something really fucking cool. But that's not really, the point, right? You're trying to build a game. And so either it's like a big thing where it's like you're building this big system completely pointlessly because you could actually just hack it and just make it like, because you just do it manually 3 times and you're done. But the other thing is like when you're trying to, like death by 1,000 cuts. Like we have this master shader, and like it supports all this thing, and then someone's like, yes, but wouldn't it be cool? But if you also could vertex paint in so the cloth is moving, and you're like, yeah, cool, sure. And then someone's like, yes, but what if I rotate the object? I want the cloth to fall down a little bit also. And then you just keep adding things like forever and become super bloated, and it wasn't actually that efficient because you refused to, just commit to the limitations that you have. So you do need to know when to stop, which is super hard. It's basically a gut feeling. But then sometimes, you need to just do it the old-fashioned way. I almost never build high-poly models ever anymore. It's kind of a bit of a worst-case scenario because you're building an entire model that has nothing to do with the game. It's not on the disk. It's not in the game. It's just that thing that you get a texture from, right? So if I can avoid it, I avoid it. It's like maybe 0.5% of the objects that I build that have a high-poly model. But it also depends on, what kind of object it is. How many are you building? What kind of shape language do you have? Like the more objects you have that share the same shape language, the more likely that you can just do it in some other way. Certain shapes you just can't capture without doing high-poly models. Like if you do like FPS weapons, they need to look good, and you just can't hack it. So then you should do that. Unless you're like, hey, we're an indie team, we're going to make a game with like 500 guns. It's like, then you probably shouldn't make high-poly models because you'll be screwed. And if you do high-poly models, you should really use a kit bash library. And I've seen a lot of artists that are opposed to using kit bash pieces because they didn't build them. So that, that takes away, like, I didn't really build this model. I just took someone else's stuff and built it. But it's like Lego pieces. Like, you don't see anyone complaining when they're building Lego. They're like, yeah, these fucking Lego pieces. I could build better Lego pieces. And I would build a completely different Lego model because I want round pieces. Why don't I have round pieces? And a good side benefit of using Kitbash is that it basically enforces art direction. Because, art direction is from the smallest detail to, the grandest scale, right? But if you use a Kitbash library, you're basically going to force the world to have like a unified feeling. You're going to have the same screws, you're going to have the same bolts, you're going to have the same little engine pieces. I mean, maybe it's going to be less variety, but you're basically going to accidentally enforce art direction. And that's also a side benefit of creating, custom workflows that have built-in limitations, because those limitations quite often enforce the art direction. Because like, if we can only do these things, everything is going to automatically become more unified, because we have, like, we made this workflow and it suits our needs, and basically it's going to mean that everything is going to look a little bit samey, which is called art direction. And yeah, so you basically get like a specific look that you end up with because you force people to work, or encourage people to work in a unified way. So, for example, at Neon Giant, we have a very custom workflow because we have 4 artists, which includes the VFX artist, and half of us are tech artists, and we're making a large game with tons of hard surface art in it, and we have no concept artist. So we have an art style that needs support tons of curved, annoying shapes, lots of pipes, lots of details, and we also have very little time. And we need to make assets that are everything from like a few decimeters to like 30, 40, 50 meters big. So we kind of had to merge concept art and in-game art, and then try to keep it as non-destructive as possible, because we need to iterate on things, because you're basically iterating on the design and the in-game model at the same time. And same thing with gameplay. Like, if we're going to change things in gameplay, we don't have time to go back, redesign, rebuild, rebake. It's like, no, we just have to be able to just fix it like now. And it's also like a dirty art style, so we can't just go without textures. We need to be able to auto-generate things, for example. So, on the other hand, we don't really need to make the best-looking models ever. They can be kind of fugly. So it's basically just all the hacks you can, ever come up with are okay. And I mean, the point with these rules is not that you can't break them. Like, you create all these rules for the artists to use so that they can work as efficiently as possible. But the whole point is like, you create these rules so that when you're going to do something that doesn't work with these rules, you can just say, fuck it, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way, because you have saved time and resources. And that's that's basically the goal, right? Because the goal is not to create a workflow and then stick to that. The goal is to create a game, and the workflow is just a way to focus up like everyone's the way of working, so that actually they work as a team in the same way, and it's much easier to control. Like, for example, if you're going to optimize the game, right? If you give every artist, they're like, we can do whatever we want, then basically every single thing is going to be built in a different way, and it's going to be way harder to just look at things. When you're going to optimize the game, you basically have to go through all the things manually instead of doing like broad strokes. And say that you do all these things and it still doesn't work, and your game doesn't look as nice as it should be, and you should just just change the direction, because no one actually cares about your initial direction, right? When you create a game, people don't go like, yeah, but the original prototype idea looked better. Like, no, because they don't know. Like no one cares about your initial idea. They just care about what is out there. And if it's super successful and everything is great, you can always go back and make like a making of documentary and say like, yeah, it used to be shit, but now it's great and it's fine because we won anyway. So in Wolfenstein, for example, we had to pivot a bit and like work more with the engine, because having clean surfaces didn't really work well, because you have very limited shading. So we just went like, okay, like you have baked shadows, they're pixel perfect, you can have perfect soft shadows on every light because they're baked. So we just go all in, and we just go like, everything is filthy, like everything is covered in dirt, there's like puddles everywhere. Puddles are great. We just like put puddles in dirt and like very dramatic lighting everywhere, because that's what we could do with the engine. And then like the end result looked way better. But no one knew that, or now people know, but no one knew that we were actually having a much cleaner look. Like some of the locations were way, way cleaner. And then we just go like, all the cleanest locations are the ugliest. Put in stuff, right? And the same thing with the tech. Like, there's a limit on like how good an asset could look in this engine, because you had limited shading, you had limited resolution. It didn't matter if you made the best looking asset ever, because it wouldn't look like that in the game. So instead what we have to do is like, well, we can have unique stuff everywhere, and we can have a lot of stuff. We don't have to care about draw calls, we don't have to care about these things. So we're just like, let's just put tons of stuff everywhere. Like, right? It's like density. We can have density. Let's just put that everywhere. And we just push in like, you say 2 crates, I say 500 crates. Because why not, So that was just like, we just had to, pivot and change things a little bit and just embrace what we could do with the engine. And it didn't really fit with like, conventional, like we're going to make these super nice high poly models, we're going to put them on ArtStation, and they're like, look, they're so shiny and nice. Like, no, like it's density and the amount of content. So just, brute force that. Just to make the game look as good as possibly could with the tech. And that is pretty much it for me. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tor, for this wonderful presentation. We have some time for questions. If you like to ask some questions, please come to the stage. Any questions? Raise your hand. Yeah. So if you have, come here. We can save some time.
Okay, so I want to ask you about using external tools in smaller companies, because at some point we have to stop updating the tech because it might generate more problems. It can fix the previous problems, but it can generate more problems. So at what point you decide when to stop updating it? It's on the start or maybe in the middle of production, and when to choose?
It depends on how brave you are, I guess. No, it also depends completely on which tool it is. Like things like my modeling tools, like the content authoring tools. Like we don't care, we just update until the very end. But because it's better to have that as a process than never updating. But when it comes to engine stuff, yeah, then that also depends on how how complicated your game is. Like, can you actually make sure that things are working? Programmers are always very afraid of updating, and I'm like, I just get new cool stuff, so I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi. Obviously, most of your advices stick to sci-fi style specifically, like making multi-use trim sheets using kit bashes. Is not going to work with stylized game or RPG medieval times environment, right? But it doesn't matter. What would you recommend with using these techniques for sci-fi artists not to be repetitive and look like 80% of ArtStation and sci-fi artists?
Well, I would say that it's just, first of all, it's just a tool, right? So what kind of content you put into the workflow can be completely different. And I actually think you can do fantasy art using like these kind of methods as well. Because you can, think outside the box. I mean, it's about analyzing what you want to do, right? You look at it and you look at like what's this actually made of, like what is actually the building pieces. And then you can work backwards from that. So, but I think that just, well, try to, I mean, if you look at other sci-fi art, like on ArtStation as your reference, the odds are pretty high that you're going to end up looking kind of like them if that's what you're basing your work on, right? So try to find references and ideas that are outside of the video game art community. My favorite example is when people are modeling like AK-47, etc. Look at the sewage truck, the one that pumps out shit from the street. Like, those are awesome. They're like super cool designs. I've never seen anyone build a poop truck, but they're really fucking cool.
Thank you. I like you as my reference, so thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a nice talk. I have a question about legacy assets, because we are running a project that's been growing for quite a while, and we've started from a messy prototype phase, and there's been a pivot, and we have a lot of legacy assets, some prototype assets still in the game. We need to decide, are we going to make them again? Are we going to just pimp them? What do you do when you have 2 years of assets of wildly varying quality, and you need to somehow bring things together, both for performance and for the keeping consistency in the style as well?
Well, it depends a little bit on how broken they are, right? But in general, like if you can, in some way, first of all, use them in a way and kind of hide them, that's great. Like, use them as filler content, right? Like you don't want a set piece that is old and broken, but they're great for filler content. And if you can like systemically bring them like higher quality, like updating all the textures, just slapping some dirt on them, for example.
Because part of the issue is that it's a sort of really boring job that you need a really qualified people to look at.
Yeah. That's making games.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we have time for one last question. No? Nothing. Okay. Thank you very much, Tor, once again.
Thank you.